tell me about survivors poetry and its community, the community side of it.
Survivors Poetry started in 1991 in response to the gap that there was at the time for poets to express their experiences in their work about mental health issues. The term survivor is a self-identification, and it encompasses being a survivor of mental distress in whatever form that has taken for you. Um, and also, if you've experienced child abuse, addictions, eating disorders, have a neurodiversity, and we are a community that provides safe, intimate spaces to share our poetry and music with each other. We're not separatist. Events are always open to friends and allies who feel an affinity and supports our movement. Especially when it started in 1991, it was a stand-apart group. It was part of the survivor movement in London at the time, where there were a lot of campaigning groups like CAPO, Campaign Against Psychiatric Oppression, Survivors Speak Out, SOAP, Speak Out Against Psychiatry, Recovery in the Bin, later Mad Pride, and the Mental Health Resistance Network. So it's kind of located itself within that survivors movement. There were four founder members: Frank Bangay, Joe Bidder, Hilary Porter, and Peter Campbell. Frank had been working with another friend of his, Eric Newby, and had established a small group called CAPO, which stood for Campaign Against Psychiatric Oppression. And
Okay.
as Frank and Eric were both poets, they were organising poetry readings in psychiatric hospitals and mental health day centres. Joe Bidder had encountered the poetry scene that was just sort of getting underway in London at the time. And him and Frank got together and they came up with the idea of survivors poetry, which was about creating safe spaces for survivors of the mental health system to share our poetry. Survivors poetry kind of started in Joe Bidder's back bedroom in his flat in Hackney, but then funding was found for a worker, and that worker was me. I applied for the job and got the job, and we had a little office in the Diorama Arts Centre near Great Portland Street, which became a hub of industry and activity. And we established monthly survivors poetry performances in the Camden Community Centre. We were applying for funding left, right, and centre. We were kind of on a roll. We were a doyen of the London Arts Board, and we got funding to set up an Outer London Boroughs project and community projects. And we had OTs and mental health workers calling the office saying, "We want a survivors poetry workshop and performance. Can you bring
Mm.
it to our mental health venue?" And then there was the funding for an outreach worker. We had a UK-wide network of survivors poetry groups. They were all applying for funding locally, but we were connected as a network. Um, I left after that point to go and work in Homerton Hospital in a patient support group. But
Okay.
after that, there was also a mentoring project and a publishing project. Things were big for survivors poetry in the 90s, the late 90s and the noughties.
Mm.
Um, but sadly, after that, at some point, the funding was lost.
Yeah.
Um,
That coincide with the what do you call it? The banking crisis, the 2009.
before that, yeah,
All
it
that.
was before that.
Yeah.
And poetry fell out of favor. It was extremely difficult for any poetry
And
groups to get funding.
would you say that neoliberalism has had an effect?
Definitely,
The,
yeah, and
the the dominant political thinking, or whatever way you
Mm,
want to put it.
mm.
Yeah,
And also the fact that the arts getting disinvested left, right, and centre, and poetry was the
yeah.
one of the first casualties of that. And whereas people had been raving about the reasons that we had been putting forward to get funding, that we're engaging in creative healing and we're making each other better by sharing our poetry and music, they could still hear us, but that there just wasn't funds there, and it's remained so to this day. It's become you know really difficult for artists and art groups to get funded with the Arts Council. So
Um,
today we survive as a collective of people working for nothing, working from home, keeping survivors poetry going, meeting on Zoom at the moment, but hoping to go live again before the end of the year with events in London.
my platform is about reform in mental health. And what's your thoughts about creativity, what it has to offer, empowerment, and what have you seen? Has it what the positive effects of your work?
The main thing is stigma busting. So
Okay.
we're putting stories out there that are still unheard stories, that are still very much not in the mainstream. Um, but I think by having a presence and so many people over the years consistently drawn towards the self-identification of survivor, and that being helpful for them, and using survivors' poetry as a platform to put out these stories that the current trend with poetry, live poetry and spoken word is tending towards the confessional, which suits our work very well. And I'm convinced that we've helped to change the narrative in mainstream media, about the way that people talk about mental health, and people are more willing to not have a denial, um, of about mental health issues, which can only lead to greater enlightenment. It's a great thing, and I'm positive that survivors' poetry has had a positive effect on that.
Where would you say survivors' poetry and the work that it does is within the arts and the world of poetry and literature, etc.? Where does
It's
it
it's
fit in?
it's interesting you asked that question, because over the years I've become convinced that survivor poetry is actually a new genre. I mean, we've got poets from time like John Clare and Sylvia Plath and so on, who were known to be what we call survivors and who were great poets.
Mm.
Such a groundswell of poets who are writing not just sort of personal confessional work, but naming the unnameable, and thinking outside of the diagnostic framework, and finding new ways to express their experiences, which can be very complex and unusual experiences, but putting it in such a way that it's understandable and relatable to people. I think within survivors' poetry, we have an automatic understanding of each other. In any case, like if you come to a survivors' poetry event, you will get such empathy. You're bound to come across people who have experiences that are similar to yours. Um, the term survivor doesn't just kind of limit itself to survivors of mental distress. But also addictions, child abuse, eating disorders, neurodiversity. Um, and within that sort of wide pool, people are creating a work that's striving to express ideas and notions and experiences that have never really been heard as poetry before. So I see it as a separate genre. And yeah, I hope it gets remembered as such in the future.
And separate genre, but you also said a new genre. Um, What's
Mm.
your thoughts as we go forward, or hopefully go forward? Um, what do you think? survivors' poetry have got to offer the future, because as we know, we're coming out of COVID, and anxiety, nerves, whatever you want to call it, is very prevalent, and people are beginning to, what's the word, acknowledge our vulnerability, and it's more mainstream than it used to be.
I think that people will look to the poets that survive as poetry as people who are able to articulate wisdom on these issues that are still to a certain extent taboo. There's a lot of talk about anxiety and depression in the media, but experiences that are perhaps more extreme, that lie slightly outside of that area, like psychosis or the kind of experiences that would mean a hospital admission, it is sort of quite often um, hand in hand with it to deal with those experiences. So, we're still pushing those boundaries. There is still that, we've kind of touched the tip of the iceberg, I think, in talking about mental health issues in the mainstream. Um, but things are opening up, all the time. Every celebrity who you see on TV now is fessing up to some mental health experiences or other,
Very
and
true, very
um,
true.
yeah, opening up a conversation about mental health um, is another route to reclaiming our human rights. Um, I live in Hackney, and that although it felt at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the noughties with Mad Pride that we were changing the world, mental health services where I live have gone backwards. Um,
Yeah.
there's no advocacy provision anymore, um,
Mm,
which is a crucial thing. If you're detained under a section, you need to have somebody to speak for you and to act for you. Um,
definitely.
and this is happening all over the country. So we've actually
Mm.
gone backwards as funding is removed bit by bit from mental health. It always was the Cinderella of healthcare, and it's become the malnourished, starving, abused Cinderella of
Yeah,
mental
I'm
health.
laughing, but the metaphors are very accurate. Um,
Hmm.
I'm putting you on the spot now because, being a poet, um, I think to myself, have you got a poetry? Have you got a poem appropriate to the moment we're to our conversation? Have you got one up your sleeve? Have you, or have you got
I
one
could.
nearby that comes
If
to
you give me a
mind?
minute, I've got some here. Let me have a look. We say that at Survivors Poetry. We say whatever the mood of your music, bring it to Survivors, and we suck up dark material. People never feel. We always make sure people don't feel pressurized to be entertaining or funny. Um, so I've got a very unfunny poem here
Go
that I
on,
can
go
read to
with
you.
it.
Okay. Uh, so I got a benefits assessment form before we went into the pandemic, which kind of compounded the misery that I felt at that time. And this is called "Was She Pushed?" Yep, got another benefits form in the post.
Carry on.
Start to spiral, feeling lost. So many intrusive questions raking up the past. Been dreading this for 6 months. Translate your existence into clinical language. Pride goes in the dustbin. Dignity is a privilege not afforded to us. In the day to day, I try to cope, but seeing it all written down signals the death of hope. How many years since I functioned at all? Since I crashed into the wonder wall. I tell myself daily that tomorrow's another day, but when I read through my notes, looks like I got worse. Write it all down, give it some clout, every detail of my dysfunction clearly spelled out. When did it all start? Being raped, not my fault. Acute psychogenic psychosis, heart and mind in revolt, just a teenager. The grief I carry has never abated. Feels like those ghouls are basking in my pain. Their sadistic pleasure is underrated. Tell us about washing, now you're obese, sitting, standing, toileting, every tablet you take again and again and again. Fresh evidence required each time. Write a thesis on how your life fucked up. We'll add it to the pile of your previous forms, all stating the same, like a twisted prenup. Make each award for 5 years at least. Chronic and deteriorating, severe and enduring. You're not going to find me at a steps class on my day off or playing football in the park. So why the persecution? I become my own prof. The emergency clinic is in a state of emergency. Come in daily to see someone for 5 minutes who I've never met before. We're really stretched. It's a busy time. Take this prescription. Come back tomorrow. Who's next in line? I spiral into psychosis, the nightmare waking dream. Got to do this evil form, can barely think. Need a friend, a less weak link. So this is my new norm. Extension after extension, then a 3-month COVID reprieve, now another deadline. They're feeding off my panic, got a vendetta against us. This is modern eugenics in the middle of a global pandemic. Threaten to put you in starvation, capitalise on your deprivation. If you feel like jumping, you'll get a state-sponsored push. Fit to work, don't make me laugh. When was the last time I even made it to the cafe for a chat and a cuppa? Trapped at home in bed, stuck inside my head, in permanent quarantine with the shadows of the past all around, sick to my spleen. It's no use, 'cause it's us and them. Has anyone ever felt self-destructive? Here's the very means. Analyse your weaknesses over the past however many years that led to hospitalisation on a section over and over again. Psychosis, schizo attack, mania, depression. Not just words on a page. A diagnosis is not just for Christmas, whenever that was. The velvet fist in the iron glove is the threat of destitution, the constant psychological war that just adds to my condition. Take my infirmity, judge my affliction, how much it's worth in pennies and pounds, long-term psychiatric medication, loss of cognitive function, the backdrop of screams and suffering sounds. And if we keep on harassing, maybe we'll hit the jackpot and this one will jump off a cliff if we just send one more form. Primary care, is anybody there? Don't make me laugh. The community team is in crisis. No face-to-face appointments because of COVID. No support available for months. So just keep us begging, drowning in our grief. Erect a statue with a victory wreath to every cheating charlatan DWP leaf. Put it on our early graves, say Atos did well. They ground them into dust slowly and with stealth. Tick the box mark deceased, add up the dull money saved, hold a Zoom webinar on how to get away with it, increase your expense accounts, polish the next bullet, wear Tommy Hilfiger, vote Tommy Robinson, stand for mayor, suck in the dead opponent's air and savour it, go on holiday and shoot an elephant, because no one will notice, it won't hit the news. Their snarling snarls broaden, she just had a short fuse. So if you feel like jumping, you'll get a state-sponsored push. Come on now, focus. Question 1. How to describe brain mush? Quickly, quickly, the clock is ticking. 72 hours till the deadline. Live like this, like an obsession of terror and degradation, of panic and psychotic ideation, of a tunnel with an advancing locomotive, of what's the point in all creation, of what's the meaning of nihilism, so darned low there is no ism. Are we having fun?